Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited today to be here with Daniel Geraci. He is the founder and CEO of United in Crisis. United in Crisis equips churches to form local crisis response networks to meet emotional, spiritual, physical needs of survivors of natural disasters. He recently published a book called United in Crisis, a true story of God's miraculous power working through a united network of churches. So Daniel, thank you for coming. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show, Peter.
Now, you were originally in the Texas area, and Texas was obviously majorly impacted in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. I mean, so many people there because it left like millions of people homeless. It flooded like the bulk of the city. It was awful what was happening at that time. And I know Texas got the bulk of the Louisiana refugees, for lack of a better way to say it. Was that kind of what you're talking about here with United in Crisis? Is that the type of stuff that's happening right now?
Yeah, well, we definitely have since then. That seemed to really launch a lot of ministries. Katrina opened the eyes of many people, but since then, and really since 1900, I've done some research on this. Disasters are on the rise worldwide. It's around 6,200%. You know, back in 1900, you used to have 5 to 10 major disasters worldwide a year. Now it's well over 400, disasters worldwide a year. And these are major disasters. The increase in size and scope has just been, pretty tremendous. Also, just in the U.S. alone, I also looked at let's just look at the United States. Sometimes in America, we can kind of look aside and say, well, those are different countries, different places, and maybe it's just the way that the environment is. But actually in the U.S., back in the 80s, there used to be on average a total of $28 billion disaster events per every 10 years. Today, looking at 2023's numbers, we had $28 billion disasters in one year. Last year, we just got the numbers for 2024, and it was $27 billion event. So it's no longer happened in 10 years. It's now happening almost every year. And the frequency of that is now every 16 to 20 days versus every 60 to 120 days. So it's just a massive change in the way that we see life in America these days.
So I've argued many times on this show, I think part of the problem with Christians overall has been the church. I think the church has gotten kind of soft, kind of weak, and doing things. Are we seeing with this increase of natural disasters, churches, are they able to, are they ready for it? When I say churches, not only just the kind of the leadership within churches, but the church community as a whole, the Christian community as a whole, are we ready to handle these type of situations that you're talking about, especially the rapid increase of them?
Yeah, from my own perspective, and I've been doing this for 15 years, the church is not ready. The majority of the church is not ready now. The church has done an amazing job. We can take the most recent LA fires or North Carolina disaster, and my gosh, if the church did not respond, it would be an absolute disaster. We get an A+ in giving stuff away. That we've always done very well. We also get an A in mobilizing people to actually start the cleanup process. We get a great start. And then there's some amazing nonprofit ministries that come in that help out those communities and churches. And really without them, we would be really, in trouble. But the problem is, this is where we don't do too well, is the long-term side of recovery, which is walking alongside of survivors until they're back in the feet. And this goes back to in the days of Jesus, when he tells you the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a crisis, and he shares to us kind of his desire for how the church respond, not only just in disasters, but in all forms of crisis. In this particular case, a man is left robbed for dead, and two people, a priest and a Levite, walk by and do nothing, and they actually walk on the other side. But yet the Good Samaritan stops and helps them out. But he doesn't just give stuff away and doesn't meet just only the immediate needs. No, he walks alongside of that survivor, puts him on his donkey, gets him to an inn and to what we call a safe and clean place for him to get back on his feet. And then he says, hey, I'm going to come back and make sure that if there's any other needs are met, I am here to help this person out. This is where we are missing it, is that, and the main reason is because we're not united. Now, in every one of those two examples I gave you of Los Angeles and in California, there's some great work happening. Most of it is independent, churches just doing what they are feeling led to do by the Lord, but there's no united effort. There's no large church network effort that's formed yet that I'm aware of. And this is really where we miss it. And really the only solution is to form a crisis response church network and to begin forming a plan. And from there, it can really take off.
But churches are notorious for uh, podium envy. Like I'm afraid if I'm involved here and I allow you in, you might steal my parishioners. And I know there's a lot of churches out there that are way above that, and there's a lot of healthy churches out there that aren't. But there's still a lot of that there. How do you handle that conflict? Does that make sense? Because it's like, well, I want to get involved and have my people get involved, and this church says I want to get involved, but to unite them together to say, hey, we need to actually deal with the problem at hand as a group collectively, versus, hey, I just want to, each of us bring water and then we're done for the day. Like, is that a real issue out there?
It I would say yes in regards to in blue sky times, meaning that there's no disasters, on the horizon or impacting them. For sure, that's some of the scene, and like you said, there's some that are already working to unify the church. Some beautiful organizations that are working, trying to reach the lostness of the city. And Austin, Texas, where I come from, there's a great movement amongst churches to do that. And then we kind of came along at the same time, forming the Austin Disaster Relief Network. Now, it was a crisis that began to set the pastors' minds in a proper place to say, we really can't do this alone, because these disasters are bigger than one church, bigger than a government, bigger than, what we could all try to do by ourselves. We have to work together. So, that beginning story when you cheered about Katrina, well, we had 6,000 people flood into our city. We had never seen anything like that before. Prior to that, we had 200. And this is probably where a lot of cities stand. They'd never really seen anything before, so they don't think it's going to happen, and why get ready? But then suddenly another hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, bringing another 18,000 people. That was Rita. Then Gustav hit, sending thousands more. Then Ike hit, sending thousands more. 44,000 people were evacuated into Austin over 3 years. We had never seen anything like this. But unfortunately, because of the lack of planning, lack of training, the church wasn't ready. A handful of pastors went into the convention center where all of these survivors were during Hurricane Katrina, and they were kicked out because they said, this is caused because of your sin. You're here because of your sin. And the city heard about that, immediately. Churches allowed into any of the convention centers, any area where survivors are located. And for those 3 years, the church was ineffective. We couldn't do anything. So when we came on the scene, it was such a Jehovah setup. It sometimes takes a crisis to wake up to the point of, we cannot do this without each other. And that's what happened in Austin. I see that happen all the time. So in times of crisis, to answer your question, a lot of pastors will say, it's a shame that it took this to bring us together, but we really need to work together. So it is a much easier time to get the church to work together. My prayer is that, the Lord, that we don't have to have more major disasters for the Lord to get what he wants. He did cry out in John 17:21 and 23, his desire is that we would be one so that the world may know that the Father did send his Son and that the same love that he has for his Son, he has for them. And I'll touch more on some of the whys, but hopefully that answers your question there.
Yeah, it does. It always shocks me when I hear stories like that. I don't know why it should, because I know if Satan's going to attack, he's going to attack the church is one of his areas he's going to attack. He's not going to attack strip clubs because he already has those people. So, but even every time I hear it, it's always just amazing to me. So, do you think now, as a whole, do you think the people look to the Good Samaritan to be the government instead of the church? Do you think that's what they're looking at right now?
It is from America to even South Africa. I'm going to just call it. Most likely, it's the same everywhere. I have not traveled every nation in the world, but I've recently gone to South Africa. It was the same there, where for some reason over the last 150 years, well, the reason is I believe it's just the enemy creeping in. The church has kind of given up their position in the city as the Good Samaritan. If you look back in the 1800s, and one of the best books on this subject, I highly recommend it for the pastors that might be listening. It's called The Tragedy of American Compassion by Marvin Olasky. He did all the research. He pinpoints exactly the people and who and when and how it happened. Where just a little over time, the church went from running, he gives a case and scenario of the Bronx and Manhattan, where 120 churches worked together, ran 321 ministries, which basically covered all the orphans, the poor, the universities. They ran all the daycares, the schools. I mean, it's amazing. The church did everything. You actually needed Sunday off to rest, truly rest. So that way you can go back in the mission field. But the church was the Good Samaritan in that community in those days. And I believe probably most likely same across the earth because the government didn't have what it does now in place. But a little over time, the government began to say, you know what? We see that homeless man there. Why don't we give him money? And money will help him, material things will help him come out of that place and position. And we know better than that. The church at the time was actually helping them, equipping them, helping them emotionally, because a lot of times it's emotional, spiritual stuff, but also maybe it's a trade that they need to know of in the middle of their crisis. And so they would get them back on their feet. But the moment the government began to offer funds, those homeless people stopped coming to the church and they started going to the government. And I think a little over time that happened to in every one of these areas of crisis where, the churches said, looks like the government's got it. And I think that's what's happened is that when we see someone poor, we think, well, there's food stamp programs, there's all kinds of things. But the problem with that way of thinking is, number one, the Lord never said in the story that it was the Roman government that picked up this man and took him in and made sure that all of his physical needs are met, emotional needs. The church's job is to do this. And the main reason why is because the goodness of God, the goodness of God is on trial in a time of crisis, I believe. The devil is whispering in the ear of that person, if there was really a loving God, why would he do this to you? And then sometimes if it's a disaster, especially the government or insurance companies are saying this was an act of God. So it's being declared all around that person. And if we are not there to reveal the goodness of God and be the light that we're supposed to be in our city, that person walks away. Maybe they got their stuff back, but their internal house is on fire. And the worst disaster of all is that they go to hell and they spend eternity there. And we never had an opportunity to bring the good news and reveal just how good God is through the church.
That's I never thought of. I mean, all the contracts I've seen with the acts of God provision, I never actually put it in perspective now. Like that has completely changed right there. That one statement you made has completely changed the way I'm going to look at those in contracts going forward. So are the churches now prepared for the emotional needs, because the government doesn't provide for the emotional needs either. You're right. They just give them the financial support and be like, okay, here's your check, go away. But is the church prepared for it? And then what do y'all do to help churches train for that?
Yeah. Great question. In the 14 years I was with the Austin Disaster Relief Network, and that's a network of over 200 plus churches, I think we've trained close to 10,000
Wow.
individuals for crisis in the greater Austin area and have seen well over 16 major disasters, three of them catastrophic. Just giving your viewers some backdrop.
Yeah.
Seven historic, rest major, and then about 260 small disasters. What I've seen is that there may be chaplains that have been trained that stand in a booth-like setting where all the survivors come in. They call them multi-agency resource centers, is how they try to pull agencies and all the people together that help people in one room so a survivor can walk around and find whatever his needs are and get them from these individuals. What I see is that you see a table that says chaplains or emotional care. Very few people go to those because they're embarrassed. Especially if they're men, they don't want people to see that they're weak and broken maybe. But inside, every single survivor that was impacted by that crisis is traumatized, and you cannot just grit your teeth out of it. And so I don't believe the church is equipped for large disasters. Maybe the church has a counselor that can handle some cases within the church body, but we're talking about thousands of people. And what the Lord led us to do in Austin was to train the body of Christ in what we call individual crisis intervention, which is helping people pull them out of their trauma, bringing the spiritual and emotional care together, praying with them, inviting God into their situation. But when you do this, you begin to take them out of their trauma to where they can now put life back together because their mind is no longer scrambled like a ball of emotions. And that's what happens to us when you're traumatized. Literally, your mind has got about 50 emotions going on all at the same time around. It's a confusing thing. A lot of people think that something's wrong with them. We have to actually let them know that that's normal. But yes, the way that we can help the church and those that might be listening is that they can come to United in Crisis, our website. What we do is we walk alongside of cities. We help them form a crisis response church network. We help them identify that right leader that will lead this organization full time and raise up a volunteer team behind them. We provide the training, the coaching. We'll actually walk with them for a whole year. We have 15 years of experience, combined experience. It's around 40 years. And we just will walk with them for 12 months. It's kind of what we do best. We know it very well. We've helped launch a total of 11 crisis response church networks in the nation, actually one in South Africa. And it's what we love to do.
So, you mentioned South Africa. Does it change based off cultural differences and how you respond, or is trauma pretty much the same across the board? Just what creates trauma might be different.
Yeah, it's almost like the Bible. I know the Bible version in South Africa might be just the slightest little tweak, but yeah, it's the same. What the Lord has ordained here will be ordained there without a hitch. I mean, when the church unites, he promises he will always show up. It commands a blessing. When the saints are equipped for the work of the ministry, it will produce fruit. When we walk like the Good Samaritan alongside of survivors, helping them get back into a safe, clean home, the Lord will show up. And surely he loves it when we share the gospel and make disciples and we pray together. All those things will produce and move the heart of the Father to say, step aside, I'm coming in to be part of this. And it's so much better than trying to do it out of your strength or independently when we're trying to do this as a single church without a desire to work with a network of churches as such an easier way. It doesn't have to be so exhausting. It could be so much better. My hope and prayer is like Isaiah 2. It says in the latter days, the church be on top of the mountain. I pray that the church is on top of the crisis response model in every community, that they not only use this this model that the Lord has given us. And it is a model to handle crisis, no matter how many forms of crisis in your community. It could be tens of thousands or just several hundred. The Lord has given us a plan to give away to cities, so that way it's organized, there's a plan in place, people are trained, and they know what to do and how to do it, what to say, what not to say, most importantly. So that way you're not kicked out of the church. You're not looked like a second disaster in your community, that the church doesn't become a hindrance, but becomes really the hero. So that way the community says, I never knew the church was this good, and ultimately driving people back to the church because of all the things that the church is doing for those in crisis.
You obviously, again, our main job is to make disciples, to share the good news. I mean, and that's the Great Commission, just as a whole. How do you respond to critics that say the only reason why you're getting involved in this is just to make converts? Like, that's all you're doing. And again, for me, I'm like, okay, so what? Yay, that's great. Again, I'm on the 100-year plan, not the next year plan. But I'm sure there's a lot of critics that are there who are also coming to help and aid in these situations, that are misguided, but they're trying to help. How do you respond to those critics, or do you even bother responding to those critics?
Yeah, we in Austin, Greater Austin, Austin is second most liberal city in the nation, so that's a great example. We had some kickback in the beginning days, but a lot of fear going, what is this going to look like? So they're imagining, and the enemy's throwing in some pretty terrible scenarios for them, right? So they're fearful. But it wasn't until we began to deploy and showing them that, man, these guys really care and love people. For the Red Cross, at first, we were butting heads just for the first year, until they began to trust and they saw that they actually needed us, because Red Cross is there. They do a wonderful work where they provide, they're right there when the event happens. They provide the cup of cold water, some food immediately, shelter, but that's it for them, right? And now they're normally having to tell those survivors, I'm so sorry, that's all we do. It's what we're called to do. A lot of people used to get upset at them in Austin, but now they just say, well, now we've partnered with the Austin Disaster Relief Network. That's for them to do. The rest of it, they'll walk alongside of you, providing the short and long-term care, which is what the church is supposed to do. So now every single survivor that is impacted from a small house fire, apartment fire, they now get passed on to the church in the Greater Austin area. And the mayor and the Highland, what they call Homeland Security official that's over all the disaster response for the city, they're the Emergency Operations Center leader. He told me once, he says, yeah, I get sometimes people just don't like Christians. He said, well, I would tell them, until something is better than what these guys, they're doing their amazing work, I will not abandon them. They're doing too much of a good work. And if you think about it, Daniel had the same favor with Nebuchadnezzar, same with Joseph and Pharaoh. It's because the work of excellence that they presented on behalf of the Lord. And that's what we're doing. We want the church to be as recognized as the fire department, police department. The church should be in every one of those key meetings, on planning meetings for every form of crisis. Why not? Why not own that mountain in your city?
So and I don't want to put words in your mouth on it, but it sounds to me that the most challenging aspect of this is earning the trust of people around, to start. Would that be the most challenging aspect, or is there something else that I'm not hearing?
That's would be a challenge. I would say just the pastors joining the network is another, just as big of a challenge, because again, it's a new thing. They may be afraid of what it's going to mean for them. And here, for pastors listening, in all fairness, there's a lot coming on pastors' plates, a lot of nonprofit ministries showing the latest thing that they should be part of. What a true network should do is become the great admin for the whole church community, to take that burden immediately off the pastor. And the reason how we do that is we form a crisis response church network core team within their church. So that way it's that team of volunteers that we train. They're the ones that shoulder it. So that way the burden's not at all on the pastor. It's not one more thing he's got to take on. No, we actually put it on that person's shoulders. And the only thing that the leader needs to do is just stay in connection and relationships. So especially when a disaster strikes, they're working through that core team of great volunteers that have been trained, and they're the ones that are mobilizing the body, making sure that people are getting trained, of course, in coordination with the leadership of the church. So that way the church can be the church. The pastor can be the pastor, and his staff can minister to the people in the community that are hurting without getting burdened and overwhelmed with the actual crisis. I've seen it in Austin now. So, I mean, because it's been in place for a long time, a church can walk with 80 families, shepherding 80 families, and still not even feel the impact of that because they have this amazing core team handling that with all their trained volunteers. And they don't have to be overwhelmed and burned out through that whole process, which is normally what happens to communities in the church when a crisis strikes. The pastor and the staff immediately begin to handle it as if it's a sprint, it's a marathon most of the time, and they get overwhelmed, burned out, sometimes implode. I've seen churches implode in times of crisis.
Now, sometimes churches are impacted by the crisis. Like, I don't know this specifically, but I imagine in LA, they probably lost several churches in those fires. I can't imagine it not having, having some. And then you have church shootings, et cetera, where there's a lot of trauma and disasters kind of in that side. And I know, again, this is more natural, bigger disasters, but in these situations, how do they provide? I know they do, but how do they provide help for those church families as well?
Yeah, normally when it's that kind of disaster, we've seen events where it's 90% of the community is impacted. Number one, depending on the city and the community and just the impact, sometimes Lord has led us to raise up a church network with the neighboring city, with those churches, and they help those churches within the disaster zone walk alongside them, help them even mentor or walk with their families, depending on the size, committing that they won't take a single family, but helping them establish kind of what they need to establish to get their families back on their feet. It is so important for a network in place to come alongside of a church leader to get them back on their feet, because you want the church to thrive, right? We're in it together. One suffers, we all suffer. And that's really the mindset that becomes what you end up seeing when you see a church network. I'll give you a case example. 2018, we helped raise up the Highland Lakes Crisis Network in the hill country of Central Texas. And they had a massive flood, 2,500 homes impacted. 40 churches said, we're forming this network. And one of the fastest responses I've ever seen, 2 years later, they had every one of those families that said, we want the church to walk alongside of us. They had 600 families say that. All of those families' homes were rebuilt, repaired in record time. The mayor starts saying, you know what, this is the most amazing thing I've seen. We'd like to give you land and property. Can you take on the homeless community situation? Can you also take on the single mom situation with children or abused moms? But in the midst of all that excitement, a pastor dies suddenly who was very young. And oh my gosh, the church network just came around that pastor, his wife, his family, their congregation. They stepped in and began taking and rotating until they can raise up another leader in that community. I mean, I thought about, the initial impact and then the God stories that were happening all around, but a tragedy struck within their own community. And boy, they often thought about that. What would it have been like, if this network had not been in place? But what a beautiful picture. It's a great testimony. They're still going on. Wonderful story to look up and go online to look at Highland Lakes Crisis Network. Yeah, they went beyond disasters, which is our recommended, why we changed the name to United in Crisis, because we think this model serves for all forms of crisis in a community.
I think what y'all are doing is absolutely amazing, and it's so desperately needed. So if a pastor's listening to this or any other church leader and they say, hey, I think we need to have this in our community, what advice do you give them to start on this?
Yeah, great question. Just simply going to our website at unitedincrisis.org. And then on the main page, you can just see there'll be a place where you can sign up for our discovery meeting. We'd love to talk to you personally, find out what's going on in your community, what the Lord is doing, what the church is doing. And then from there, normally it goes into typically a lot of pastors will get together to have a meeting with me, and that's when they make a decision whether they want to move forward or not. Maybe that many is like 10 or 15 pastors, but it starts with a small nucleus. That's all we need is just a small nucleus of churches, and we need to find the man or woman of God in your community that God's calling to be that spearhead leader that will lead the network. And then we have everything else. We're kind of like, what Burger University is to McDonald's. If you wanted to become and own your own McDonald's, you have to go to Burger University, get some training. You're there for a while, and then they send you off and you open up your McDonald's. We're not a franchise, but what we do is we give everything the Lord has given us away for free. Other than the initial training, there's some minor costs, but really with all from documents to training videos on how to train your people. We actually give you the videos to train your people, along with badging system, credentialing, just everything you can think of. We provide. We could take someone from 0 to 10 in a very short window of time, and off they go. They could be working their own community within a very short period of time.
Yeah, I just as you're typing, I was kind of going through the website, and it's really good, and you were talking about the badges, and those are things that I don't think a lot of times we think about, those little things, and probably a lot of stuff you had to learn on the go. It's like, oh wait, we got to add this to the list for next time and add it to the training. But the website is easy. It's easy to move around. But it's unitedincrisis.org. I highly encourage everyone to check that out. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you talking about. I appreciate what you're doing. I think what you're doing is amazing, and it's absolutely needed in so many different levels. Just not only help the people in the crisis, but to help the church as a whole. I think we need that type of stuff, and I think it's amazing what you're doing.
Thank you. And if I could say one more thing, United in Crisis book is a great tool for pastors, people, anyone that want to hear what the Lord does when churches unite together. Lots of God stories in there. It will encourage you and hopefully stir you up to become a Joseph for your own community.
So, real fast on where can they buy that? I assume Amazon. Where else can they get that?
Amazon is it right now. We haven't opened the channel to any others, but they can also go to unitedincrisisbook.com, and there's a lot of videos that tie into the book on that website if they want to actually watch more about what the Lord has done through a united effort.
And for those of you who would like to make a monetary donation, it's also on the website on how to do so and how to support the organization as well. So, Daniel, again, thank you so much. I appreciate you being on.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Peter. God bless you.
God bless you.